guess we'll get started. 13 minutes in. I hope everybody listened.
We did.
I'm just going to look at Sophia because she's the only person I haven't asked yet.
She did.
Gordon said he listened to it 3 times. I don't know how many times I listen to it. I just listen to it every day until I take notes on Monday. I'll let my mind digest things, yeah. Mm-hmm. It starts off in Genesis chapter 2. And the thing that I had never noticed before was when he says that no shrub had yet appeared, but in Genesis 1 he said, let the land produce vegetation. I was just like, okay.
Yeah.
So obviously these are 2 different things. So Genesis 1 was a poem, and now we're into some meat, I guess, but it still seems not 100% accurate, not a scientific lab report still.
Oh yeah.
What do you guys think about that?
I think the point is it's a story, and the whole point is trust the story. So it's not, it doesn't have to be historical. It's still fact, but it doesn't have to be chronological.
Right.
And I think that's where our Western mind thinks chapter 1 happened, then chapter 2 happened, then chapter 3. We have this chronological mindset when it may not be so chronological as we always assume. So
God has a tenant mindset. He's going forward and backward at the same time.
Reminds me of forwards in books, or even just intros into chapters, where maybe they might have a quote that ties into the chapter, or that ties into the beginning of the story. And so it's not necessarily maybe not the whole story, but it kind of gets you in. It kind of serves as just a kickstart to it.
Mm.
I like how you say that because I think
Sure.
after a while he starts talking about that. How they get to a certain point before Abraham is the forward to the story. It's setting up everything up for this character that's going to be introduced named Abraham. So I like how you pointed that out. Anybody else before we move on?
I just wonder though if people that have a non-Western mindset, Greek, Eastern, whatever you want to call it, because Greek is more Western, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that don't think that way, do they even care about that stuff? Do they go, well, how did he do it? Was it 7 actual days? Did he this? Or do they just go, okay, he did that, so let's go.
Right.
But we get bogged down. I think I can get bogged down in all that trying to figure out stuff.
Well, I think we talked about it during the intro, our first session, about how Easterners think of things in who did it and what was done rather than how it was done.
Good
Right?
point. Yeah.
They're not interested in the how.
Yeah.
Like we are.
Yeah. They trust the story.
Yeah, exactly. So in the Hebrew, they were talking about the tree being in the middle of the garden, but I guess it wasn't actually in the middle of the garden, but I liked how they pointed out how Eve had made it the center of her garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how many times do we make things the center of our life when it doesn't need to be or isn't supposed to be?
Yeah. It's very true.
And then in Genesis chapter 2, 20 to 25, it says Adam didn't have a suitable helper. So then God has him name all the animals. And I wonder if while he's naming the animals, if he sees there's male and female of all the animals, and he's like, oh, there's no female for me.
That's a good point.
Because they talk about how the whole point of him naming the animals was because he didn't have a helper. And then it talks about him, well, in our version it says the rib, but he was saying how it's a round in the Hebrew.
Right.
And growing up, I always had the theory taught to me that it was the DNA. Like a piece of his DNA was taken out, because that's like the helix is like rib-like, So that's what I always think about when we go through this.
we didn't know DNA when I was taught the story.
That was before there was DNA.
Yeah.
That's right. There was no DNA testing then for me either.
And then I also think about how the chromosomes, Like the male is the XY, female is XX. You know, so was he XYX and then the X was taken out? You know, or is it just that's why the woman is only X's because it was just that part of the man taken out? You know, just thinking.
Does that make her his ex?
It's an interesting thought.
But I don't know. I think the key is that it came from him,
Mhm.
and whether it's X, Y, or whatever, it came from him. And so, for man to be complete, to have that suitable helper, that's why he needs a woman.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It was from him.
That's so interesting. It just dawned on me because he said last week, I think, or the week before, he said we need the Western way of thinking too because what all the scientific stuff and everything. But back then they didn't know all this stuff, so they didn't really dig into it. They were just like,
Mhm.
you know, you're here, I'm here, okay, let's go. But then somebody somewhere started going, but why? But why? But why? But why? And now we're way on the other side of all that stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like a little kid. Why?
Yeah.
4-year-olds and college professors.
Yeah.
And we want to know why.
So I like how they were talking about how he named her woman. It was Isha, and the man was Ish. But then later on down the story, we'll get to that afterwards, but he talks about how he named her Eve because of what she could do. Isha was just what she was.
Yeah.
And
That's cool.
we'll get to that later, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of plant that now. So he starts talking about Esther Kenegdo and the help that opposes or the help that comes against. And I always think about how true that is because I couldn't imagine having a wife that didn't do that. That's why I wanted some female voices here because I wanted to know how you guys perceive that, how you think about it, what you think about it.
Well, one of the things I thought about was how, when he was talking about the help that opposes and the need for tension, it made me think about how, when I think of confrontation, I think there's a very negative connotation to it, but it seems like that confrontation was what God had intended, not for it to be bad, because that's kind of what we make of it when it gets bad. But we need opposition to, I think, even balance.
Sure.
And I think that's what God
Right.
intended, was for us to be able to balance, and however way that happens. So that's kind of one of the things I was thinking about.
I think that's a really good point because it's not about opposition like we're fighting all the time, but together we're stronger. You know,
Yeah.
it's through that opposition that you get stronger. You're more secure in what you believe and where you stand because you've got somebody there to balance you out and to work, make sure you're on the right track, that your thinking hasn't gone off the side somewhere. You know, you got that helper. He didn't really discuss that word,
Mm-hmm.
Eber, so much, did he?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think he did, because that's a very cool study. I read the book on gender roles in the church, and it talks about that word helper, and it's the word Eber, and that word is used for woman, but it's also used for God. When God is our helper, God is our strength, and it helps to realize, because he did talk about that he was brought from man, and that doesn't make her less. You know, that I grew up in the age of man's the head of the house. Have you ever seen ads from the 60s?
Yeah.
Very
There was
different.
I saw this ad of the 60s where a man is giving his wife a spanking because the coffee wasn't ready.
That's wild.
And it's like,
way.
next time she'll make sure the coffee's made.
Dang.
And you look at that like, that is so crazy,
Yeah.
insane. But we had that for a long time. Of she's the little woman, she's the little helper, she's She's less than, and I've even heard it taught, man was created in the image of God. Woman was created in the image of man.
Mm.
Which is, that's not true.
Right.
That's
Right.
not true, because chapter 1 says
Right.
he created them
Both.
in the image.
God's own image.
So both male and female have the image of God in them. But I think it's important to, if we go through and we study what an Eber woman is, and that they're not subservient. And it's a really interesting
It is. Proverbs 31.
look at it, about how powerful God's view was. She was a suitable helper, just like God is a helper. And it's a really good study to look
Yeah.
into.
Yeah, we often think about like the God-sized hole in people.
Mhm.
Well, then, like,
There's a
there's a
woman-sized
God-sized hole, and then God was like, "That's not enough of a hole. Let's take another piece out." So now you need someone else. I like how Sophia was talking about the tension that, and the confrontation. We always think about the negative outcome of a confrontation. We don't think about positive outcomes of confrontations. But when we have confrontations, we come out stronger. We come out
Yeah.
thinking better than we thought before. Some of the bad trains of thought that we might have had, we get out in that conversation, and then we don't think about that anymore because we realized that was dumb to think that way.
Right.
You know, I like there's a guy who said, you know, when you're in your head too much, you get weird.
Yeah.
Right?
And so, like, when we're in our head too much, we start thinking that these things are right, and then somebody comes along with that tension, and they're like, "Yo, what are you thinking? Like, that's nuts." And then you're like, "Oh, maybe that is a little nuts now that I say it out loud."
Yeah.
So I think, like Sophie was saying, we need that tension in our lives. And then he gets down to, now we're getting into the tree, where, you know, God told Adam not to eat of the tree or you will die. But then Eve says, God said, don't touch the tree. And then they were talking about, did Adam add to what God said, or did Eve add to what God said? Either way, I don't think it matters, but they changed what he said. And then if they hadn't, would she have still gone through? If Adam had just told her the way that God told him, would she have done it? You know, that's just, I'm sure that's just a rabbi thing, like Midrash teaching. They have to think of every single detail because they have to.
Well, I think it's human nature with rules.
Mhm.
When you look at the Ten Commandments, and you compare that with all the rules that the Jews had.
Mm-hmm.
They had 10 Commandments, but they kept adding
Mhm.
something else. And so, you know, you shall not steal. And then they put, you shall not even think about stealing. You shall not even, I mean, boom, boom, boom. They got a law to protect the law, to protect the law, to protect the law.
Mhm.
And that's just kind of our nature, is that if you don't touch it, you won't think about eating it. And pretty soon they'll add a fence, and then they'll add you can't even get into the pasture. You can't even go into the orchard. You can't even, because that's our nature, is to keep adding, because we want to help God out and protect the tree. So we'll just keep adding rules to it, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, I just wonder though how that, because I agree with that 100%. I think that's great, but I wonder how much we hurt by doing that, because the more somebody tells you don't do something, the more your tendency is to want to do it. But not only that, if we say, you know, like these are rules taught by men, which what Jesus talked about, right? And when they were talking about the Corbin and whatever, Matthew, I think, talk about rules taught by men. But when there's rules taught by men, I think because you break those rules, now we start this spiral of feeling guilty. Finally we get to where we broke God's law, but it's because we started way back there feeling bad about it, and we kind of, you know, and setting up all those hurdles. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to that. That's really, there's a lot to digest. I think that's really.
That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about hurrdles. Like you hit one and then you just keep tripping, like trying to get to the end. Dang, I forgot what I was thinking
There's a
about.
lot of
stuff
in there.
Kind of like what Roddy was saying, and I think that was in the previous podcast where he was talking about the Sabbath rest. You know, in our culture, you know, when we view sin, You know, we internalize it. You know, it's in our hearts, in our minds, it's inside us, it's part of us. But I like when he said that in the Eastern, you know, way of thinking, is it's not inside, it's just an action, and it's external, it's not internal. So you stop it, and there's no more sin, and we move on. You know, and he used the analogy that we in the West jump into Genesis 3, you know, where Adam messed up, and you know, so we expect God's punishment all the time. Whereas, you know, in the East, they see God as, well, he created us in his own image, and he was happy, he was pleased, and then he rested. So our job is to rest. And I love it when I never made the connection that the Sabbath, it doesn't start Saturday morning when you wake up. It starts Friday night before you go to sleep. So you start with rest. You, in the middle is rest, and then you end in rest. and so that's what God wants us to do. And he doesn't want us to worry about how many bricks we have to make, or if we're going to meet our quota or not. And he got a call from a student and says, yeah, I'm practicing to do a Sabbath. And I'm not saying we need to go back and start applying all the Old Testament laws, because, you know, there's a few scriptures in Galatians that talks about why we shouldn't do that. Because if you're going to obey one part of the law, you got to obey all the law. But, you know, there's a good thing about resting. And his student called up and says, I'm trying to, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? And he said, no, I can tell you right now, you're not doing it right because you're upset, and because you're trying to do it right. Mm-hmm. You're not resting.
Yeah.
I like how the other guy's like, if you mess up, just start the next time.
Start the next Sabbath. Just starts
start
over
the next
again.
time.
Yes.
Yeah, we're too busy living in chapter 3 instead of chapter 1
Yes.
with God's rest. So then they start talking about the serpent tempting Eve to eat the fruit.
Interesting.
And I had heard stuff like that before, like he's awfully human-like. But that comes down to the end when we'll come back around to us not being an animal or a beast.
Right.
But I liked how they started talking about desire was entered into the story.
Right.
Like all these other things existed and then desire came along. And that makes me wonder, like, after they ate the fruit, if that's where Adam's mind was, his desire for Eve, rather than just loving her for who she was. He now had this desire, like, oh, you can make children, like, so now you're the mother of everyone, like, that's your name, Eve. And so I wonder if a part of it was just the desire from the fruit.
Yeah, and in verse 6, Galatians 3, verse 6, it says, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. You know, and that doesn't sound bad at all. You know, I mean, I wish I were wiser. But, you know, at some point, it changed from a good thing to a bad thing. And, you know, it didn't say anything about Adam at that point, and maybe it does later. I didn't quite get it. But you're right, that's where it started. It started with the desire to be like God. Now, maybe to be like God, well, I want to be as big and strong as he is, so, you know, I can, you know, do what I want. And I can see where that would definitely cross the line. But, you know, it says that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. That point interested me there.
I thought about that. If you lived in an area like they did and had all of your needs met, everything was met, there wouldn't be any room for desire because you have everything. So it wasn't until someone started whispering in her ear and started hearing someone else's voice saying, oh, I'm missing out on something here. It was the first time it was basically introduced that way, because before she had everything taken care of.
So was Genesis 2 the first FOMO?
Yes.
Fear of missing out?
Yeah.
Mm.
Very possible.
Hey, well, and you think about how Satan was thrown out, cast out of heaven for the same reason, was that he desired to have the same position as God.
Right.
And so,
Good point.
here you have the serpent whispering in her ear, hey, there's more out there. More than you know.
But even that concept that it's good for knowledge or wisdom, that was added. That was something else added to the story.
Mm.
It wasn't in the original
Right.
concept, and God talked to them about it, or at least it's not reported. And that's where you talk about that again, how it's added. So they're looking and they're adding it. They moved it to the center of the garden. They added the wisdom thing. They started adding on to the story rather than just trusting the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he makes a point to say that part of the temptation was that she would be godlike. But he also makes the point of saying they were already made in his image.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So how should they become more of what they already are?
Yeah, by planting the image that they weren't, but they could be.
And you'll see that throughout Scripture. You think about when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. He was tempted by questioning who he was.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it gets us in trouble when we begin to question who we are.
That's a good point.
And so that's that one thing we always got to keep in mind, that I am created in his image, then I have everything. And it's one of those things, sometimes you don't know that you do know something. And so being able to understand those things when we get into those places of questioning our identity, that we just have to learn to remember who we are through him.
I think one of the things that he brought up was interesting to me, that he said, the tree was called the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. But obviously they already had a knowledge of good and evil, or else she wouldn't know not to do it. And then he asks, should she be punished the first time or the second time? Because I mean, usually when your kids do something and it's not going to kill them, you don't punish them the first time. You just say, hey, don't do that again. Next time I'm going to spank you. And they do it again, and you spank them because they're always like, hey, I got to find out if you're for real. Are you really going to spank me? And I think that's just one of those things, the problems, the red flags to make you look for the treasure.
Right.
Because then he starts talking about a chiasm again. How the opening verse is Adam, what did he say? Oh, Adam was alone. And then at the end, Adam is alone again as he gets kicked out of the garden. And then it works its way back to the middle, the center verse of the chiasm. And it says, then the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. And I like how he talks about the lullaby effect, because we don't pay attention to the talking snake, and then we don't think about how many times they talk about being naked, like throughout this whole story.
Yeah, and this particular snake was walking, and this particular snake was talking, and he was actually reasoning. And I mean, he was very rational, he was very human, but it says that he was a beast.
What I've never got is it says he was more crafty than all the animals. And I'm like, were all the animals crafty? He was just the most crafty one?
There are some that are crafty.
Well, I think that's the whole point about the whole thing is that when we read Genesis, I've always been taught to look at the Bible literally.
Yeah.
And if you really get in there and look at it, it's not literal. It's Genesis 1 and 2 aren't literal, although I've always been taught that they're literal.
The literal mess, if you try to
It
read it
happened
that
1,
way.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It happened in this order and everything. And so the whole thing is not literal. And I love the part where he says sometimes we have to look for the problems. What are the issues?
Yeah.
You got a snake here that's talking. Did anybody get that?
Right.
I've heard that story all my life, and
How is she so comfortable talking to this?
it was okay that she could stand there
Did
and
the
talk
other
to
animals
us.
talk too?
That's a question.
Was she talking to the monkeys too, and possibly the elephants and the rhinoceroses?
But they all knew, like, hey, don't mess with that fruit.
Yeah.
Well, one monkey already got kicked out for that.
Well, it wasn't until the serpent was cursed that he had a crawl on its belly.
Yeah.
So that's giving you indication that it was able to walk around, whether on 4 or 2 legs, or
Oh, no.
but was able to have legs and move around.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could have been a Komodo dragon.
Did
Determined to snake,
it
but-
talk regularly that she was so comfortable to talk to? I mean,
Did they have?
She didn't
how
seem
long was it
freaked
around?
out by it.
I know.
But I do wonder though, because he talked about the good and evil thing, but I thought the knowledge of good and evil, because she knew not to eat it, but she didn't really know evil. You know what I mean? Like she knew we're not supposed to do that, but she didn't really understand maybe the gravity and maybe
Right.
that's the
You know,
knowledge of good and evil. Because like our kids, right? When they're little, we tell them don't do that. They don't really understand everything. They just
They
know
don't know the
mom said
cost.
or dad said don't do this.
I mean, I understand the cost.
Yeah, but the older they understand because they, you know, I just wonder if that's what.
Right.
The
that's
tree of cause and effect.
Yeah.
The knowledge of cause
Well,
and
because then
effect.
shame comes in, right?
Right.
Because we were
Now,
naked.
what did it cost?
Yeah.
See, I don't know they do that.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there's other things that we've done that we didn't know was gonna cost that much when we did it.
Yeah.
And that's when shame came in.
Equated to like wet paint. The wet paint sign. What do you want to do?
Touch
Yeah.
that.
I gotta touch it.
Or the hot plate.
I gotta make
How
sure.
wet is it?
Is it really wet?
Yeah.
I remember one time working construction, we put dry paint. Nobody touched it.
Yeah.
It's not interesting when it's
Not
dry.
interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned the word in verse 1. It says that the serpent was more cunning. Some versions say crafty.
Mhm.
The Hebrew word is arum. And I'm not smart. I looked it up. And I don't speak Hebrew. Because I can't make that sound in the back of my throat, that, you know, the furball sound. But anyway, it means to be subtle, shrewd,
Yeah.
crafty. You see, Satan's lies, you know, they're not obvious. They're subtle.
That's a good point.
They're crafty. You know, he added some things in there. He took the truth and he just corrupts it.
Mm. Yeah.
Just a tiny bit, just to kind of get you going. And once you're going, you don't realize you're going in that direction because it's so subtle.
Yeah.
Then at some point you're hooked and you don't even know it. And he's got you fooled. He's got you deceived. I mean, the Bible tells us he deceived a third of the angels in heaven. To me, I can't imagine that. I can't even imagine one, much less a third of the angels. But if he can deceive a third of the angels and convince them to follow him to hell, wow. You know, thank God that, you know, he's there to be a buffer between us, you know, as long as we choose him.
Yeah, I like how he brought up in Hebrew, the word for naked is arom, and then nakedness is arom with it. So the first one's an O, the next one's an E, and then the crafty is irum.
Arum,
So,
uh-huh.
and he's like, if you're hearing this
Irum.
story, you're like, wait a minute.
The
Did you
serpent
just say
was-
naked again? He's the most naked
The serpent was the
animal
most naked.
He's more naked than any other wild animal.
See, that's the thing. We don't get it. We miss it in English.
Mhm.
But, you know, but it's there in Hebrew. And they sound so similar. But
I keep wanting to pick apart that word and understand, because I don't know Hebrew, but I'd like to think about language in general and how, and even in English, we can just add a letter or a few letters and it's exact opposite of what the original word was. And so I'm thinking about the crafty one, and the other one is naked, and it's almost like if you're looking at somebody naked, you see them plainly. There's nothing to hide. But crafty is almost like
Yeah.
they look naked, but they're still hiding everything. So it's almost like it's plain, but it's not. So there's that lie, that underlying lie behind it. And that's just a random thought I have about the word in general. I don't know if that's true or not.
I think the thought that Gordon brought up was so true about how Satan tells you like most of the truth, and then he just bends it a little bit
Just a
to make
tiny
you,
bit.
to make you not know that he's, lying or deceiving you. I hated professors in college that would do multiple choice
Oh, yes.
questions, and
Yes.
they would ask you something, and you'd have to, and like one thing is clearly true.
Yes.
But then the other two answers are almost all true, but then you're like,
You have
is
to
that
choose
right or is that not right? And then there's
the best
D,
one.
all of the above.
Or,
and I always
or
choose
the
all
best
of the
one.
above.
Well, if you're ever in doubt,
And
choose C.
I always get it wrong. But it seems almost true, and I think that's how
Yeah.
he gets us. You
And,
know?
and I've always argued, you know, that's a trick question. And I was corrected. I said, no, it's not a trick question if you know the material.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a
That's
specific
a
reason
good point.
statistically why you do that
That's a good
when you
point.
write exams.
So do your homework.
Yeah.
kind of wonder.
I'm not commenting on
No.
Moral of the story, don't choose all of the above.
So if your students are checking in right
Unless
now.
it-
now
unless
they
you know
probably
it's
have
all of
first
the
test.
above.
Well, I think the important thing about in the text is that if we learn things, we learn through discovery.
Mm.
And sometimes those types of questions make you figure out whether you really know it or not.
Right.
Right.
Or you just guessing the right answer. And I like the whole idea that they talked about learning from discovery, because that's when you learn something.
Mm,
If we
yes.
tell you there's 3 things to do,
Right.
then you'll remember 3 things.
Right.
Or 2 of them, first and last.
But if you have to discover for yourself, you might come up with 5 things. You know, then that's the difference here, is that we're trying to build, and when we teach people, we need to build them to be disciples of Jesus, not just follow all the rules. Because we come up with all kinds of rules, and some of those rules have nothing to do with Jesus.
Absolutely.
Because we kept adding a fence and a bar ditch and a moat and a river and a wall. I mean, we added all these other things
Sharks and lasers.
that don't have anything to do with the point of chasing after Jesus. And well, that's one of the things that we have to learn to do, is to help people learn by discovery. Who is this guy?
Yes.
Who is this guy? Why do I want to be like him? And that's discovery. It's not, can you name the 7 things that we talked about last week? You know, that's a different thing, and I think that's what Genesis is trying to do. The
Yes.
author of Genesis is trying to get us to discover who God is and who we are through discovery, not through just a list of rules. So it's not as literal as I've always been taught.
Yeah.
Well, but it's like you were talking about earlier about the ads about women and their roles. You were talking about that. I can remember growing up in the church that I grew up in, and it was basically taught. They would look at the women and say, "It's your fault that we're in this position."
Mm.
Have you guys ever felt like that?
So
We all joke.
But like that's, because
But Adam was there
it was
too.
like all the men were like,
Right.
"It's all your fault why we fell." You know,
But that's
it was
such a
kind of
dumb
like
argument
it's like
because-
pointing the finger. But now
Right,
you
well,
look at this as like
There was that
we were,
it was said, and there was that attitude.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
But that's
but as
That's
you
one of
discover
the-
through
one of our
this, you're
many
going,
faults.
it's like, okay, we were equally in this together in choosing to do this, and there was different accountability that went with it. There was different things handed out, but they were equally.
Adam
chose.
failed in that he didn't protect his wife.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we follow
Why
his
are you
example.
talking to this stupid snake guy? You're supposed to be talking to me.
We follow
Well,
his
that's,
example.
see, that's
because-
even in the story. It talks about how the snake. The guy we're talking about. Maybe there's that idea that the snake was trying to move in.
Right.
You know?
To take Adam's place. Right.
Take
To have
Adam's place.
offspring.
She
That's
should have
why.
been listening to the unicorn, not the snake.
That was
No.
weird.
And that probably wasn't their first time talking. I mean, if he's really
If
crafty,
she's that comfortable with
Yeah.
talking, to
Yeah.
yeah, he might have been building up to that
Right.
until finally getting to the point where
you build that relationship.
Yeah, how many days was he?
But he had
whistling
an
at before
ulterior
she
motive.
listened?
Right.
You gonna say something?
Well, yeah, it was a few statements ago, like what Mark said, that, we
Yeah, it goes
experience things. We need to learn about God through experiencing it. And I remember a few podcasts back where he says, in our culture, we look at Genesis 1 and we try to look at it as an experiment. We try to figure it out. We try to understand it. But in the Hebrew or the Eastern way of thinking and seeing it, it's like you trust the story, and they lived it out. They experienced it. They didn't have to try to figure it out because they had already experienced it. So, but we don't. That's not our tendency. But that really made me think.
I think it's part of our human condition to want some sort of rule or regulation to follow. Because
Absolutely.
That's easier to have someone tell us what to do
Yep.
and try to figure out what am I supposed to do.
Right.
And so it gets to the point that our principles or a list of whatever becomes more important than the relationship. And so it can easily become, say, our faith can become more important to God. Because we find there's 7 steps to healing. I go through checkbox 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 7. So my faith is in the fact that I checked all the boxes. and not the one who does the healing.
Mhm.
You know, my faith is more in my not moving the faith and not the one who moves the mountain. And so I think that's just part of our human condition to want to do, because it's easier to follow rules than allow that relationship to change.
But it's hard to follow.
It is.
That's why we're so frustrated.
It's hard and easy.
It's
hard
the
to want
easier,
to.
it's the easiest, hardest part. Does that make sense?
I think having the bullet points of information kind of makes people not want to dig. They're like, oh, I got it.
Sure.
You know, I got the 7 bullet
I got
points,
the bullet
whatever.
points.
I don't need to dig any deeper.
I missed the rest of the message.
But there was a comic strip I saw today. It was so awesome. One of my favorite artists. There was 2 little like mice characters, and the little kid mouse to the dad mouse was like, "What's the moon made of?" And he said, "I asked my dad the same question when I was a kid, and you know what he did? He handed me a stick." And he's like, "Why'd you give me a stick?" He's like, "Because if you build something up to the moon and find out yourself, then it's going to be worth more." And so, of course, it like shows him build it up, and it's like a bunch of like lightning bugs that make up the moon. It was such a cool little cartoon. But as kids, like, tell me what it is, and he's like, he just hands him a stick. He's like, go find out, because it's going to be worth more to you if you find out yourself.
Hmm.
And I think we miss out so much by just taking it from somebody else, because that's really what they think about it,
Right.
or
That
what
lack
they
of
understand.
discovery you were talking about.
Right. He talks a lot about the lullaby effect.
Mm,
You know,
yes.
we've heard the stories so often.
Right.
It doesn't even dawn on us that there's a snake walking around talking.
Or a talking donkey later
Doesn't
on
even-
in Mullen.
Doesn't even register that there's something wrong here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This doesn't follow the natural order of things.
Well,
Yeah.
and then like you read one chapter and then it almost repeats into the next chapter, but they don't line up. And then
Sure.
as far as like
Yeah,
the
chapter 1,
English,
chapter 2 don't line
well,
up.
and it's like they tell the same version, but it's like, but when they talk about how this is poetry and how it's a chiasm and how it zips together, then you're going, oh, now it's starting to make a little more sense. Why, when could God have made the earth in 6 literal days? Well, yeah, he probably has the power and ability to do that. But, my mindset was, God made it how he wanted. We have no idea. And like one of the things, I'm learning about my relationship with God is sometimes God just doesn't tell you anything. Doesn't need you to know because you'll screw it up.
Yeah.
You're on a need-to-know basis.
Or you will mess it up.
And it's okay not to know everything.
Yep.
It's okay not to have it completely figured out.
And that's hard for a Western mindset.
It is hard because we want to take God, we want to
I wanna
shrink
know,
him
and I wanna know
down
now.
to something that we can grasp, something that we can put in our pocket, and we need to do the exact
Sometimes I can act
opposite.
like Hazel with God.
Doesn't it
Like
all?
how he
That just
treats
blew my
me,
mind.
like, treats
Doesn't it
God
all
like-
go back to what he told
I
Eve?
wanna know now.
You can be like God.
Yeah.
And isn't what we're trying to do?
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
making it all understandable, we're trying to be like God by trying to make it
And
understandable.
why? So
Because
that,
we want to be like God. So
And
we're doing
why?
exactly what he did.
and why? Because we want to be in control.
Yeah.
See, we don't want to trust the story.
We don't trust it. Yeah.
We want to have all the answers because we want to trust in ourselves.
Yeah.
And is that why the central point of the chapter is nakedness?
Possible.
And why did God focus on that? He calls out to him, "Where are you?" I mean, he wasn't like, "I wonder where he is."
Yeah, I really love that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't want to ruin it.
Oh, go ahead, yeah. I don't have it in my notes.
You can have that yours?
No, because I had
That's my
all this
key.
other
That
stuff.
was
Well, let's order off the menu then.
Yeah.
I need people to bring it up. It's a conversation.
Well, I thought that
Adam
was
and
a-
Eve were the first.
Well, let's go
hippies.
there.
I thought that was an amazing point when he
Yes.
asked, "Where are you?" And that word, that where, isn't like,
I don't know.
I don't know where they are,
Right.
but they're supposed to be here.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
not where you're supposed to be.
Right.
When he says, "Where are you?" And that hit me the hardest, I think, of the whole
Mm,
thing.
yes.
So when God asks, "Where are you?" it's because you're not where you're supposed to be.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
it's not like he didn't know where they were.
Right.
Right.
And he says, he didn't know they were naked. All that was, he knew all of that, but they weren't where they were supposed to be.
Mm.
And they weren't comfortable with who they were.
It's almost like when you You're in your house, and your kid is supposed to be in their room, cleaning the room, but they're off doing something else in another room, and you're like, hey, where are you? You know where they are,
Right.
but you're asking them so they know where they are.
They know they are not where they're supposed
You
to
know
be.
where you're not supposed to be. Yeah.
What's cool is it wasn't like he didn't say get over here. He met them where they were at.
He didn't try to correct them.
He
Yeah.
didn't say, well, it's okay, you're naked, this is okay. He said, okay, let's deal with this.
But then he focused on that. He said, who told you were naked? You know, so he didn't ask him, why did you do it?
Yeah.
Why did you eat the fruit?
Yeah.
No, he just said, who told you were naked?
I love that question. It's like so many times I'm like listening to other people, listening to other voices in my head telling me that I'm not good enough.
Right.
That person doesn't like you for this reason. What
Now-
voice am I listening to?
Right.
Now I wonder, is he teaching Adam at that point? Because rabbis, the way they taught, they didn't tell you anything. They asked questions, and they knew you knew it if you answered back with the right question.
Mm.
Everything was a question. You were asked a question and you answered with a question. Everything was a question all day long.
Maybe it's because the answer is just. The answer is the treasure, but I'm thinking about like a story, and how it's not the end; it's the journey. And the question is the journey that we're always on. We're always questioning. We're always on this journey of questioning. Because I like how it talks about in the Hebrew when the snake says, "Did God really say?" They don't have it the same way in Hebrew as we do in English, where we would say, "Did God really say?" They would say, "Did God say?"
Mm.
Like, did he really say, "You must not eat of any fruit in the garden"?
Right. Because someone said something, you go, did he really say that? It's that kind of questioning. It puts the emphasis on the authority
Mhm.
of who said it. I thought that was pretty interesting.
And also adds a little bit of doubt to it. Because I loved the analogy in the podcast where he said, just like Satan, or just like the serpent posed that question. He said, suppose, and I can't remember their names, suppose, somebody said, or the host, he called him by name,
Brent.
said that the last podcast was just terrible. It was just terrible, and where he said, and I forgot how he worded it. He said,
Did he say that?
did he say that? Didn't he say that?
Did
The
you
last
really
pod-
say
did-
the recording
Did he
was bad?
really say that the recording was terrible? So, and of course, it was a lie. That's the whole point.
He was like, "Well, that's a private conversation."
I know.
I thought that was funny.
One of the things to think about too is that when he finally kicked them out of the garden, they're talking about their nakedness. Was they were already naked before? They were completely seen by God, known by God,
They were created that way.
but then God made them garments of skin, not to cover up their nakedness, but to cover up their sin. And so that's the thing about it. It wasn't just so much that they were just without clothing. That had nothing really to do with the story, but it was like what really was, now that I'm naked and I'm hiding this sin within me, that's what God's covering. And God provided also in that aspect, here, let me help you and let me cover you.
So it makes me wonder if that's where sacrifice came from.
Oh, well,
Because
Keep listening.
the animal skin was used to cover them.
yeah.
So an animal had to die
Yeah.
for them to be covered. And then from then on out, animals had to die for their sin to be covered.
Mhm.
Man, that's crazy.
Mm.
Before AIM, during AIM, we took a class on Old Testament. And before that, I had only thought of the animal coverings in just a physical sense, like, okay, it makes sense, fig leaves are not enough in the wilderness. I mean, you're gonna need some insulation. Yeah, I got it. But when we went into the more in depth with it, it was like what you guys were saying, like more for the spiritual sense instead of the physical. Because I mean, if we're just talking strictly
Something had to die to
yeah,
cover it.
something had to die. Something had to pay the price for their sin. Because I mean, Jesus hadn't come yet. He hadn't paid the final price. So this was the best that they could do at the time. because God still wanted that connection with them, even though he couldn't have that same connection that they had before the sin. I always thought that was cool. It blew my mind the first time. I was like,
Yeah.
what?
There's so much to think about that.
Because you think about in Eden, that, you know, God had the thermostat set on perfect. They didn't need clothes. They were comfy. So that, you know, it was on
I was
perfect.
thinking Eve had to go touch
Plan
that
for it,
thermostat.
She had to go mess with it.
Well, probably wasn't a thing. Yeah.
I'm having hot flashes.
That would make the electric bill go up.
See, now we're going back to blaming Eve again.
Yeah.
But remember, you know, Adam was there the whole time.
She's turning it up, he's turning it down.
I love how he talks about the ruach and the breath of God,
Yes.
and how
Yeah.
God breathed in life into us, and he made that whole connection all the way to the fruits of the spirit, and the last one being to, what did he say, to
Self-control.
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 And they were saying like that's one that people don't always think about, but like for me, that's what I think about a lot, because I've had a lot more self-control with the spirit than I've had without the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, if I didn't have self-control, I don't think I would have joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, because self-control is what it means to be like God.
And in the podcast, they made a distinction that since God created us in His own image, He created the animals, and He intended Adam to name all the animals. But there was a huge, you know, the host of the podcast made a huge distinction that we are not animals. Animals react. Animals are instinctual. If a deer feels like eating, he's going to eat.
Yeah, he's not going to skip a meal to
He's
watch
not
his
going
weight.
to skip a meal to watch his weight. I love that. I love that analogy. But we can choose. You know, we can choose. We have self-control.
My dog is a beast. Our lab, you can feed him, and if you put another bowl of food down,
He'll
he'll
just
eat
keep
it.
eating.
And if you put another bowl of food down, he'd eat that too.
Yeah.
Because he has no self-control.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, he's a beast.
And Satan was trying to get us.
I think that's an important point, though.
Yeah.
We're not beasts.
We are not beasts.
We actually have the ability to say no,
That's right.
even though we sometimes don't think we do.
We know when to say
Yeah,
no.
well, and I think that was some of the whole point of the cross, was for us to finally realize and say, enough. You know, enough of this sin in my life. Enough. I don't want to do this anymore because of this cost. Enough.
Well, I think it gets to the deeper and a bigger point of our lives in our Western world. We have a problem with there's never enough.
Yeah.
Right.
We always want more, and so we'll destroy the world so we can have more.
Yeah.
And we're going to cut down all the trees. We're going to do everything
Bring all the water.
because we want more. And if you go to a third world country, people are content with what they have.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it makes me, feel a little bit ashamed about being in a culture that it's never enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's never enough.
Yep.
Our closets are stuffed full,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
We have
it's
to get
never
storage
enough.
units so we can go
Yeah.
out and get
When
more stuff.
you go to a third world country, there's no such thing as a storage unit, because everything they have
Is there storage unit?
they're living in the storage
They're
unit.
living in the-
They have it. I remember one time I was in New Guinea and they said, "Hey, we're going to help this guy move." I'm like, "All right, I'll help." And we drive up, and the guy has 2 bags. That's it.
So your moral support?
I don't know what I was there
You
for.
can do it. Carry those bags.
He put those 2 bags in the van, and we drove to the next place, and
You helped
he
him
moved.
move?
We helped him move
Wow,
everything
what a
he
beautiful
owned.
life.
He moved it,
That's all I want is
and
2
I go to
bags.
move, and I can't get it all in the moving truck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to start giving stuff away.
Yeah, you want to throw it away. You want to get rid of it.
I know when we moved from San Diego to here, you get that last bit of junk that
Yeah.
you're trying to
Yeah.
stuff in, and I'm finally saying, "Hey, bro, you need a patio chair?
Yeah.
You wanted this, you wanted that?" And you just start sending stuff home with the guys that helped you because anyway. That
Yeah.
The point is, are we becoming more beast-like, or are we becoming more God-like?
Right.
Well,
Because we're not able to say that's enough. I've
Yep.
done enough work today. I've done enough. I've had enough fun. I've had enough. But we don't have that. We always want more.
Right.
what was the name of this podcast?
Bema?
No.
Enough.
You trust
Oh.
God.
Knowing,
No one to say enough.
knowing when to say
Say
enough.
enough.
Yeah, as they talk about his name, El Shaddai, the rabbi interpretation, if you break up Shaddai as the sentence, it's the God who knows when to say enough. And I think ending this podcast was kind of in line with ending the first one, how in the Genesis 1, we're the pinnacle of creation. And then now we're reminded that we are like God. Like, we were created in his image. We're not like the other animals that he created. And I think the beast wants us to act like animals.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like
Yes.
the snake wanted Eve to come down to his level.
We don't have control, so just go ahead.
Yeah, like stop trying to be like God. Like, come down and be with me, and then we'll
Mm.
both try to be like God. Like, I wonder if the snake wanted to be like God also. Like, that was his desire, and he like kind of incepted that into Eve. Like,
Mhm.
are you sure you're
Mhm.
like God? You sure you're 100% sure you're like God? And there's a poem that I wrote down in one of my Bibles, and I can't remember it verbatim, but it's like, 2 hearts beat within my chest.
Mhm.
One I love and one I hate, but the one I feed will dominate.
Yeah.
And it's like
Wow.
we're always feeding either the
Mm.
God or the beast,
Mm.
like
Mm.
within us.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I look at it like when he talked about Michelangelo making the statue, and God said, "This is enough." And what that brought me a lot of peace, because my whole life I've always been told I wasn't enough.
Mm.
But to realize he made me the way he wanted me, and he stopped knowing I was enough.
Who told you you were naked, right?
Yeah. And so I had really concentrated over on the last week about that, was just, I'm enough. I'm okay, you know? And that is a very weird feeling to start to feel that journey of feeling like I'm enough. When I've always been told my whole life, you're
Right.
not enough.
Well, that's our human nature, I guess, the simple side of us, is that it's never enough.
Mm.
So we're always looking for one more thing to make us complete.
Yeah.
And God is enough. But we're always
But it's whose voice you're listening to.
right. But then who told you?
Yeah,
who said
told
you weren't enough?
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
And there's all these other voices.
Yeah.
that have been
Parents,
telling us
teachers,
all of our life.
everybody,
You're
yeah.
not enough. You're not good enough.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that develop as you continue this walk with God. You develop a relationship.
Next time.
You begin to know His voice, and so you'll know the difference when that question is asked.
Yeah.
You know,
But-
that's
but
what I was
Jesus
looking
is
up
a
with
good
scripture.
shepherd.
He's a
yeah.
good shepherd.
Yeah.
My sheep know my voice. It's like
Yeah.
I knew my mom's tones when I was a kid, when I just needed to show up, and when I was in trouble. Just like your parents, was y'all that have children, you know the difference in the cries,
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
you know, and
If
so
they're
it's-
faking or not.
they're faking. You know the difference in the silences,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so it's kind of the same thing with this. As we develop a relationship with God, we begin to know His voice more distinctively, so that when something arises in us that tries to shame us, then we can know, hey, this is not God,
Right.
because we know the authentic from the fake.
You know, hearing you say that, Stephen, I just, I just want to say that I'm very proud of my daughter right now, because to me she's always my daughter. You know, she's always a small child, but now she's here, sitting here at this table, and I'm just marveling at the wisdom that she has
Mm-hmm.
about God.
Yeah.
I'm very proud.
Yeah. She was saying something earlier. I was like,
You get to eat at the grown-up table.
what?
Where did that come from?
You're not at the little kid table
Wow,
anymore.
Jimmy Kingdom, man, look at you.
Good job.
Wow.
Now, the next episode is Master the Beast. It's only 25 minutes long,
Beastmaster?
so maybe we'll turn
So how
it
do
into
you
an
master
hour.
the beast?
I'm sure we will.
Yeah. We can sit here for another
Wasn't that,
Oh.
that's an 80s cartoon.
hour and talk about that because I thought about Ray when you were
Movie.
saying.
I watched the movie, yeah.
Like a
Beastmaster.
I was
class.
thinking about
Yeah,
being
me too.
enough, Ray, what you were talking about. And I do think a lot of times what we do is we try to, like, these things tie together, what you said. We just think about things, we're thinking about things. But these guys dwelt on the word. They meditated. I don't know about these guys, but as you get further on, David meditated. And if you're thinking about that all the time, you can tell me that won't change how you
Yeah.
look at yourself, how you feel. But we hear a little bit, and we can hear the rest of the world telling us, nah, you're not, instead of putting God in to say, I love you.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's one of the, even with this, that for us to not just listen to this podcast, but to be in the scripture. And like, I appreciate that you're coming up with questions that are not even in the thing, you know, having thoughts on it. 'Cause I think that's what we all need to do, is just dwell on those things, you know, because that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think about the scripture it talks about take captive every thought.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes me think of it, like whose voice you're listening to. Like
Right.
take captive of that voice, and then submit it to God and see what He thinks about it.
Yeah.
Like, does this line up with what He's saying? Then no.
Right.
You know, even I think it says somewhere like even test angels, like test everything.
Test every
Spirits.
Yeah, test everything that comes to you.
Yeah.
And even if it's not a spirit, like if it's just your voice in your head, test it. See if like that's really what is in line. If you're godlike or you're
Well, there's so many
a beast.
applications to that. If I would have stopped and thought, does she really think that, or am I thinking she thinks that? It would have saved me many arguments.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking.
Guys,
Oh.
the assumptions and the.
Oh, my goodness.
We were in the store Sunday. We still on? We were in the store Sunday, and I said, hey, I want to look at this. So I stopped to look at something, and I thought she just left me. I thought she just walked off. She doesn't care if I have to stop and look at what she wants to look at. She
Yeah.
doesn't stop and look at and so
And your point is?
I walk around and go all the way to the door. She's not there. And I text her, where are you? And she goes, I'm sitting right where you left me.
Oh my God!
Aw.
Oh, you know,
I didn't move. You
You
moved.
walked off? I didn't. I never moved.
You know, but we could have had a big old fight over that, you know, when just, oh, you're sitting right there.
She's right behind you.
Just, her foot was hurting, and so she sat down.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I kept looking at stuff, and I walked off, and was looking at something else, and I turned around like, what, she just left?
She probably
Didn't even
said,
care.
You just
She
left
like,
me.
where'd he go?
Hi, Cindy.
But how many things if we would just, who told you that? Who told you she was just gonna walk off and leave you?
Right.
Who told you that? Who told you that? And all those things come into our heads,
Right.
you know, rather than trusting the story.
Right.
Okay, you've been married for almost 43 years. She didn't just walk off. You know, gotta trust the story and not get all weirded out over what we think.
Mm-hmm. Some are weird thoughts. Is that it?
Yeah.
That's it.
No more thoughts?
Unanimous enough?
Okay, now you can turn it
I
off.
think it's enough.
I have the gavel. We'll pray and then we'll turn it off.